This is the software development series video lecture, advanced track part 1 about VueJS, specifically the no build pipeline for VueJS. My name is Dan Van Horn. I work for the Center for Applied Systems and Software as a software development engineer. So, what is VueJS? VueJS is a JavaScript front-end framework that allows you to very easily create the user interface of your web application. Let's take a look here at the front-end comparison at the state of JS. Now, as you can see here, let me zoom in here a tad. Obviously, the most popular one right now is React.js. I don't know what this blue thing is doing on the screen here, but just ignore that. As you can see, many people have used this before and would use it again. Something very interesting, though, is Vue.js, being a less commonly used framework currently, a little bit of a newcomer on the scene, has a very large group of people who have taken this survey who have heard of it and would like to learn it. So that is a bit of the motivation for us doing this series. So let's go back and get started. So some of the Vue.js features are the fact that you can create reactive interfaces, declarative rendering of your templates. You can very easily bind data within your HTML. There is a thing called template directives that we'll be using pretty extensively to conditionally render this HTML we'll be building. That kind of falls in the same category as the template logic. With most of these more modern client-side frameworks, you're breaking up your view into components, and we will go into more detail about that. We have event handling, which is something that's very commonly used in on the front end. Computed properties that are dynamically calculated from certain values that we may have available to us in the view. We have CSS transitions and animations, and filters, which basically just allow us to do more conditional rendering and certain things based on values we might have in the view. Now, install options. What we're going to be using this lecture is a CDN. So this is the no build pipeline. Normally, what you would be using with something like this is you would be using the Node Package Manager and a module bundler like Webpack or something like that, but we're not going to worry about that today. This will be very simple. Everything will be contained in the template with a script tag, and we'll just be writing some very simple JavaScript. So let's get into it. So this right here is our declaration of our Vue application. As you can see, we have a var here. We create a new view and send in a JavaScript object as the argument. This EL property refers to the element that is the root of our application. And the data property here is essentially an object that instantiates some local application state. So it could be an array of things, numbers, whatever you might need to get your application to do what it needs to do. So I'm just going to jump right in here. In Vue, I'm sure you've all seen a static HTML page that just has values in tags. Well, in Vue, we kind of want to avoid this. We want our data to be rendered from templates, and as you can see right here, we're using interpolations with these handlebar tags right here. This is just an example of some property that is called message. Now, this message property could live in the data object that we saw a little bit earlier. But let's just move on to an exercise here and look at some code. So if you're following along here at home, what we're going to do here is we're going to create an index.html file, pretty standard HTML and body elements, and I'll show you what I have written here in just a moment. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create a div element with the ID app within our body tag. It's going to look exactly like this. And what that's going to do is it's going to give our Vue instance a mount point, basically. This is the root of our application where it's going to live. Then after that, go ahead and add the message tag within the app div. You're going to want to add the Vue CDN up at the top in the head, and then create a Vue instance in a separate script tag down below. You know, I'm probably talking a little too much here, so why don't we just go ahead and look at what we have here. So here's what I'm working with. I have my HTML tag, my body tag right here. Oh, let's go ahead and delete this. We don't need this right now. So this is basically our boilerplate for a Vue application. Actually, I'm going to get rid of this too. Sorry, guys. So what this is going to do is it's going to create a new Vue app. It's going to mount it in this div that has the ID app. As you can see, that matches right here. And for now, I'm just using the unpkg.com/vue CDN, and it's going to provide to me all of these functions, so I can just call them. So, well, what else does this exercise say to do? Well, it said let's go ahead and add a message tag. Oops. Message. And this means that we can go into our Vue app here and add a data property. And data is just going to be an object that we create right here. And I'm going to go ahead and give that a message property. And let's go ahead and say hello world, the obligatory hello world example with an exclamation point. So I'm going to save that. We'll jump over here to the example, and as you can see, boom, we've got a hello world here. Now what exactly happened? Essentially, we've got our application, it's mounted right here. Everything within this div has access on this outer level here to our data, our application state. So what we did here is we just referred to message within here, and I can go ahead and change this thing. How are you? I'm going to save that. Go ahead and refresh the page, and we can see that has updated. Another thing that's pretty interesting, let's see if I can do this here. I'll make this a little, make this a little bigger for you. Another thing that's very interesting is if you look down at the bottom of the screen here, I can actually refer to that app instance that we created. And I can use a $ to access the data property, and .message to access the message property within data. And let's give it a string that says hi. Oops, hi. And as you can see, it updated dynamically in the screen over here. So let's make this a little bigger so we can see it. So yeah, this is pretty cool. We can go ahead and change things in the console here. You're not really going to want to do this all the time, or ever for that matter, but this is just kind of to display to you that within our app this data is available, and that will trickle down into our templates in our handlebars that we see right here. So let's go back and take a look. So let's talk about Vue templates and directives. This is kind of where Vue becomes pretty useful. As you can see, we've already made use of the handlebars, or mustaches, as it's also been known to be called expression here. There's a few other things that we can add to the actual HTML tags themselves that allow us to conditionally render things. For example, the vif and velse is basically exactly what it sounds like. It's an if-else statement that we can actually use in our markup to render something, or else we render something else. So we could have some sort of variable here, since we're using JavaScript, and if you're familiar with truthy values, this would work just fine. You can also do expressions that are checking for truth, something along those lines, checking if something's not null, otherwise, or velse, we might want to render something else. vshow is basically a shorthand for vif. It's if you want to show something or not, it will just simply not render. v4 is essentially a for loop in our template, and we can use the syntax item in list. If you're familiar with for each statements in certain languages, this item is just a variable then that we can use as it iterates through this list, which could be an array, most likely as an array of some kind. vbind, this is when we start creating components that have certain attributes that we might want to pass down that message attribute that we created as the state of our application into some other component, and we'll go into that in a moment. vOn event, this just refers to perhaps a click or maybe a custom event that we've defined, and this handler can point to a function. We can set something equal to something here. We have quite a few options. vModel, that is something that we would use for an input, for example, maybe. Essentially, we would have some property, and that would map our local state, or data in that case, to this value. So whenever that gets changed, it automatically updates for us, so we don't actually have to do that. And if you want to just render some raw HTML, there's the vHTML tag here, and you can just put some raw HTML in there and it will render it. So how about we do another exercise here? This one's specifically about the vModel attribute. And this one I'm very interested in showing you guys because it's actually really cool. So well, let's jump back here for 1 second. So what we're going to do is we're going to just go back to the exercise that we just did. And what we're going to do is we're going to add an input tag within our app div. So we're going to remove our message here. Or actually, no, we'll just keep that there. And what we're going to do is we're essentially going to map this input to that message property. So what we did here in changing it in the console, we are actually going to do that with an input. So some sort of like a search bar or something that you would normally see on a web page. And then we're going to open it in the browser, change the input field, and we will actually see it update. So let's go ahead and code that. So I'm going to go ahead and put an input in here. Input, whoops, input. And I'm going to use the vModel directive. And I'm just going to refer to the message attribute here that we have available to us. So let's go ahead and save. Go back and open up our page here. And as you can see, now we have a wonderful little input, and we can start backspacing. And as you can see, that data, or state is another word for it, is being updated dynamically. So I can type hello, how about I spell something correctly? Hello world, and yeah, it's being updated dynamically. So this is a really nice feature. Say for example, we have some user input that we want, and we don't want to have to define some sort of function to handle it and keep track of that value. Vue gives us that for free. So I really like that. It's a really exciting thing about Vue. And yeah, I have to say I'm a fan. So let's go back here. Now I think it's about time we start talking about components. The days of creating a giant HTML page that's hard to read and is 1,000 lines long, those days I would say are rapidly coming to a close. Now we tend to break up our application into templates. These templates, of course, take data that we pass into them as properties or props. The data element that we're looking at here, that's very similar. In fact, it's exactly the same as the data property here. This is some data that we can define within a component that just lives inside of it, and it can be used for a multitude of different things. Computed values are something that, say, for example, you have a component that takes some numbers and you want a computed value that's summed numbers or something. Whenever these props that are passed in change, those values will be recomputed. So we wouldn't have to make sure that we pre-compute everything and pass those in. We can kind of eliminate a lot of the unnecessary data that we're passing around and just kind of create it on the fly. Another reason why this is great is because it promotes the separation of concerns, and the goal is that you want your components to be as dumb as possible. Essentially what you want to do is you want to make them only responsible for one thing if you can, and we will go into that in one moment. An advantage of this is it makes testing them very easy, and in the future you can use build tools and single file components. We won't go into that, but that's when you start breaking up your components into different files for larger applications. And you can use scoped CSS, so you don't have to worry about conflicting styles in certain areas of your sites. You have your templates, which just define how your markup is going to be rendered. And then you have your scripts, which are just JavaScript functions that you may use to compute values or make an HTTP request off to some server, perhaps. So, all right, the time has come. Exercise 3. We're gonna go right into this and add a new component. So this is the syntax for creating a new component. We'll just type vue.component. We need to give our component a name. Most often in Vue, the naming convention that is most commonly used is a dash line, or a dash in between your lowercase names here. And then, very similar to our application, we're just going to send in an object that has this template property, and that template defines how our markup is going to be rendered. So we're going to use backticks here, which is a JavaScript template string, if you're curious. And that is going to render a div that says hello world in it. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this. I suggest you do the same. It's very simple. We're going to be adding to this very soon. So go ahead and paste that directly above your Vue application. It does need to be above it because it needs to be defined before your application is defined. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this old input and this message here. Those are not necessarily needed. So the interesting thing about Vue now is, since I have defined this component called my component, I can now simply render it like this. And I'm just going to use a self-closing tag. You can also, if you want, component, can't spell. Oh, thanks for the autocomplete. You can also go ahead and render it like this if you want to. So let's save that and take a peek. So I should be expecting to see a div that says hello world, and when I refresh my page, there we go. I see a wonderful hello world right there. Let's go back here. So we've created our first component, but it doesn't really do anything. All it's really doing is giving us some static markup, just some static data. It says hello world. We cannot change it. It doesn't really do anything. So now I think it's about time we start talking about props. These client-side frameworks have a very unidirectional data flow, and what that means is that the application state, or the data that we're going to use to render our application, lives at the top level. That's the most simple way I can explain it for now. And that data, if it needs to be used by components within the application at a lower level, because they're nested, it's HTML, what the parent elements can do is they can pass their local state or local data to their children components as props. And we've already talked about props a little bit, but now we're going to get into it and start seeing what we can do. One very important thing is with this unidirectional data flow, children cannot manipulate their props. They only access them. So think of it as data that is used to render something a certain way, or perhaps you just have like a list of prices of some item and you simply want to render them on the screen. You are not going to be changing props. They're just data that helps you render your component. They are dynamic though, so you can they will change and your application will re-render those components with the new data, but normally they're being changed in the parent. So if we look at this vbind property that we talked about earlier, what this does is it says, okay, I'm on a component, I'm going to bind this component's property to my parent's data, essentially. And that a little bit of a mouthful, but we'll see how that works in a few moments. It's actually a little bit more simple than it seems. There is validation that you can use using JS native types, which are string, number, boolean, function, object, array, and symbol. So you can render them two different ways here. As you can see, this top example is a bit more verbose. This would throw an error if we did not pass in a property called text that was a boolean, and it is also required. We must pass in this prop, otherwise the component won't render. The more simple way that we're probably going to be using here is simply just an array of names here that is some variable. This doesn't do any type checking or anything, but within your component, this says that there will be a prop called text that you can access. So let's do another exercise here. Our component's a little bit boring, so what we're going to do is we're actually going to add some props, and then we're going to use our vbind attribute to send the data that we have available to us in our app, just says hello world, into our component, and we'll allow it to be rendered dynamically. So what we're going to want to do is change the HTML to include your prop with a value. Now this way, we are not actually binding. We are just explicitly saying, hey, in my component there will be a message property and I want it to have this value. That's all good and fine, but what I think we should do is we should go ahead and pass the message that we have available on our app and bind it to a message that we define in our component. So if we look down here, here is the syntax for that. We are simply going to add this one line called props. It has an array of strings, simply one string right now, just called message. Let's go ahead and add that in there. So let's talk about the data flow here. The root of our application lives in this div here that's called app. This data is available everywhere in here. So that means we have this message property that we can pass into our child. In fact, I think I'm just going to make this a little bit easier and call it text so we can really see what's going on here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a handlebars again that just refers to this text property that I've just defined. And there's one last thing we want to do. We want to connect this message and we want to send it into this component as text. And how do we do that? Using vbind. So we are going to vbind the text property inside of my component to the message property that we have available in our application. Another way that you can do this, and this is Vue specific, is you can use the @ symbol as a bit of a shorthand for vbind, but I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to keep it verbose so we really can see what's going on here. So now when I go over to the browser and I render this, I am expecting to see a div and another div, and inside it says, hello world, how are you? Because we're passing this message into this component as the text property. So let's go ahead and refresh. And there we go. We can see here, if we look at our actual HTML, let's make this a bit bigger. We have our ID application div. We open it up. We see that my component has been replaced with the template, and text has been replaced with message, which we passed in as a prop. So this takes a little bit of getting used to, but this is the format of passing props down to all components in Vue applications. It's going to be some variation of using vbind and mapping the name of the property to the name of the parent's local data here. So let's go back and see what we've got. This just naturally extends into our next topic, which is component state. As I just said a couple seconds ago, we do have local data, and one thing that is a bit different from our top level application here is this data is simply an object. This is our app for all intents and purposes. So we have some data that's we just created it. It's called message. Say we have a component, my component. Say we want to have some more state with the same exact message in it. What we would have to do is we would have to access it with a function. And this is just something you're going to have to remember. And this is very useful for forms or local view logic. Computed properties work very similarly. We're going to have to access those with a function as well. We have getters and setters for our state. State can be set and manipulated in the component that it is in. That is the largest difference between state and props. If a component has a prop, it cannot manipulate that prop. When a component has state, what's kind of assumed is either that component is using that state to calculate something, for example, or it's going to pass that state into a lower level component as a prop. And this kind of reinforces our unidirectional, one direction, top down data flow of our Vue applications. We have methods and computed properties we'll go into in a moment, but methods, as you might imagine, are simply just functions that you can call in the scope of your component. And there is something called vuex, which we won't go into now, but this is for more complicated apps. If we need to manage state, if we have a much larger data object with much more than simply a message here, we can use vuex, which is a built-in state management system, but I won't go into that. Let's just talk about creating an application for now. All right, so exercise 5. We are going to add some state and some computed properties. So what we're going to do is we are going to add a data property as a function to our component that returns an empty object. We are going to add a property called now to that object, and we're just going to make it equal to a new date. You don't have to do this if you want. You can make it equal to a string if you want, but this is just nice because it kind of indicates how dynamic our views can be. Then we're going to add one of our handlebar templates for the now property right next to our message. So we're going to keep everything the same as it is, and we're going to open that in the browser. We'll come back in just a moment to display how the computed property works. So let's see here. Oh, I'm going to go back and see what we're doing. All right, we're going to add a data property to this component. So you can do it above or below here, but I'm just going to do it below. If you are familiar with JavaScript, right now, since I'm doing the no build pipeline, just go ahead and use the function syntax. Do not use arrow functions right now. And what we're going to do is we're going to return an object with a property called now, which is equal to a new date. Okay, so let's go ahead and add another handlebars here, and simply refer to that now property. All right, so what did we do? We created some local state. Since this local state is not the app, it is a component, we need to access it with a function. That is a very key thing here. So what we're doing is when we access this data, Vue knows that now is in state, so we'll call this function and return a new date to us, and just go ahead and slap it right in there in that now handlebars. So I'm going to save this, go back over to the browser, and refresh, and as we can see, we've got a date here as well as our normal message property that we were passing into our component. And if you want to see the markup, it's exactly like that. That would be our text, and this is our date. So that's all good and fine. We can use as many handlebars as we want, but sometimes we want to be a little bit less verbose, and we would want to use a computed property. So what I want you to do is create a computed property, the exact same syntax as the data property, with a function that returns the concatenation of message and now. So let's do that. I'm going to put a comma here. The computed property is simply computed. We're going to create a function. This function will return this dot text. When you're in a method, you do have to refer to the properties as this. That is another rule here. And you know what? I'm just gonna use some old school concatenation here and say this now. You can also use no, you know what? I think I'm actually going to use template strings. Let's keep it consistent with the backticks. So this is a normal JS feature. You just use a $sign with curly braces here, and it will replace that with the string version of that variable. Just looks a little bit cleaner in my opinion. So we've saved that, and now what we want to do is, oh, actually, one thing I forgot. We're going to have to actually add this function to a computed property name. So let's just call it something. Let's call it concat, because we're concatenating our state and our props. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste that back into there. Going to make that look a little nicer because I like to make things look a bit nicer, and save that. Now we have a computed property. This is an object. We have a property called concat, that we can refer to as a handlebar. And if we save that, I expect to see no change from what we already saw. This is just a different way of concatenating our text property and our now property. So let's go ahead and look at that. Oh, well, it seems as if the date format changed, but that didn't really bother me too much. So yeah, this is just another way of doing that. Say, for example, we wanted to refer to data again and change our message property. View is fun. That computed property that we defined was just recomputed because one of the properties that I passed in changed. And that is something that triggers another call of that computed function. And as we can see here, it's exactly the same, rendered, nothing has changed. So that is how you use the computed and data properties. So that's all good and fine, but sometimes we have quite a few things that we want to render in multiple different ways, or the same way actually. And for this we will use the v4 directive. And we've talked about this before, but say we have an array here with some numbers. This is just an example. We'll create a unordered list, a UL tag. Within the unordered list, we'll have a list item, li tag, and the v4 directive goes on the element that you want to create a bunch of. So we have an array here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are the contents of the array. We're going to v4 item in array, which means that we have this item variable available to us. We're going to iterate through this array, placing that item variable within this list tag. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm just going to copy and paste this right here. What I want you to do is remove that message property from data in your app view instance. And what we're going to do is we're going to create an array of people. And each of these instances will just have an object with a first name and last name, and we're just going to do exactly what we saw before. So let's go back in here, go ahead and change our application data at the top level to have a property named people, which is an array of objects with a first name and last name representing a person. So for now, I'm just going to go ahead and delete my component. And let's go ahead and just ignore that for a moment. Let's just fold that down. So what we're going to do is we're going to create an unordered list. Then we will create a list item. And on the first one here, we're going to say v4. I'm going to say person in people. So what this does is it will iterate through our people array, because we have people available to us at the top level of our application. It will extract one of these objects out as a variable called person, which then we can use in the handlebars right here as person dot first name. All right, so we have an array of people. We've created an unordered list with one list item, which will iterate through our array of people and simply just print out their first name. So let's take a look at what that looks like. All right, so we have Timothy and we have Hannah. And as we look at our actual markup here, we see we just have an unordered list, a few list items here that have Timothy and Hannah in it. So this might not be incredibly clear right off the bat why this would be important, but let's say, for example, we had let me redo it. Let's say, for example, we had many people. They might have different names, but for now, we're just going to have a giant array of people named Timothy Typist and Hannah Hacker. Now, if I was just making an HTML page, this would be incredibly tedious, and I would not want to create a list item for each person in the people array. And that is the beauty of v4. What this will do is it will iterate through all of these people for us and render this element and the person's first name. So let's look at that. If we refresh here, we get a much larger list, and I only had to write 2 HTML elements, and it rendered that all for me. So that's a pretty simple example of just the power of using some of these directives. You write far less code. Arguably, this code is much more readable than a giant list of list items. So yeah, I think this is very useful, and you will too. So let's get a little more complicated here. I think what we're going to do is we're going to create a component that outputs a single person. We're going to add a property to that component to take an object. We can call it whatever we want. I think I'm just going to call it person. We'll have a template to output the first name, and we're going to go ahead and just use our component instead of the list item here. And we will then create a computed property. Well, after we verify that all the first names are listed, we'll create a computed property that does the same thing. We'll call it full name. It will simply concatenate the first name and the last name of the person and return that back to us. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but let's start with the component. We'll unfold our component here. I think I'm going to rename it person item person. Let's just call it list person. How about that? This list person component is going to take a property called person. Now, what I told you to do is change the template into a list item. So it's no longer a div. This is going to be a list item that takes our person and outputs their first name. So let's go ahead and get rid of this state we no longer need. And for now, we will get rid of our computed property as well, just to make things a bit more readable. So what I have now is a component called listPerson. So I'm going to use this component in place of the list item. And that is exactly, oh, not quite. I forgot one more thing. Now, we have this person variable available to us because we're using the v4 directive, which is iterating over our people array. This component takes a property called person. So if you remember, we'll want to use the vbind directive for person. This instance of person is, of course, referring to the property person in the list person component. And we're going to assign that person property to, just to make this a little more clear, I'm just going to call this person P here. The variable will be called p, and we will be passing this p variable and binding it to the person property in the list person component. So for each of these list persons, we are going to pass the person object in as a property to this component. So let me go ahead and save that and refresh. Now, as you can see, nothing changes in the final markup, but this kind of allows us to be, this is much more readable, I would argue. It makes clear what your components are doing, and now what we can do is, since we've defined our own component, we have a bit more power to do certain things. So for example, if you recall, we've created the list, and now what we're going to do is we're going to actually use the power of a component, specifically the computed property, that's going to take first name and last name of the person prop passed in, concatenate it, and return that string, which is something that I suppose you could do in the list item with some fancy handlebars and whatnot, but this is a much more clean way of doing it. So computed is an object that has properties that are computed properties. So let's go ahead and type full name, which is a function that returns a template string. Since we have the person object available to us, I'm going to refer to this, because we're in a function, person.last, oh, maybe the first name first. How about that? First name, a space in the template string, which will be rendered, another $sign and curly braces, this person last name. So this would be pretty annoying to have to type within a list item tag. It would start getting pretty verbose, so this is a nice way to break things up and make your code much more readable. So let's see what this looks like. Oh, well, before we do that, how about we actually use this computed property, full name. So we have a computed property that's available within the scope of this component. We're going to refer to that property right here, and that's going to call this function, returning a concatenated template string that simply just lists the person's first name, a space, and their last name. So let's see what it looks like. When I refresh the page here, oh, looks like I messed something up. Let's go back and look. I had a bit of a typo here where I type returns instead of returns. So let's go ahead and save that again and refresh. And now we can see that our computed property that returns a concatenated string of first name and last name is being rendered within this li tag, which is what our list person component is. It is simply just a list item tag that gets rendered within a unordered list using the v4 directive. So thank you very much for bearing with me and listening to my presentation, and I will be excited to see you for part 2, where we will be learning a bit more of an advanced techniques for VueJS. Thank you very much for your time.